Okay. All right. So moving forward. So just to give you a little lay of the land, today we're going to be, discussing sexuality. We're going to spend the bulk of our time on sexuality. We're going to go over some definitions, some terms, and then we're going to do an activity. Then we're going to move on to stigma. We're going to go through, again, some definitions, some examples, types of stigma, and then we're going to end today with a discussion on theology. We're going to define theology for you, and then we're going to explore different theologies and talk about dangerous theologies. Any questions about the agenda today? All right. Okay, so let's get into it. So sexuality. So this is what sexuality is in terms of broad definitions. Sexuality is about feelings, attractions, thoughts, and behaviors toward others. Sexuality is physical, sexual, and emotional. Sexuality is diverse. There are a lot of different types of sexuality, different ways of identifying your sexuality. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, sexuality is personal. And by that, I mean to say that sexuality is up to the individual in how they choose to identify. And so sexuality is not something we can place upon another person based on how we perceive them, but it has everything to do with how they identify personally. So what sexuality is not? Sexuality is not about who you have sex with, and it's not about how often you have sex. So again, going back to what it is about feelings, attractions, thoughts, and behaviors. But it is not about the specifics of who and how many sexual partners you may or may not have. So the world of sexuality is vast. As I said earlier, it's very diverse. And so there are a lot of different terms and definitions that are ever changing, ever growing. And so this is never a fixed point. There are new terms being created every day with the understanding that these terms are limited in their utility to describe us and how we move through our sexuality. But for our intent and purposes, I think it's imperative that we give you sort of a lay of the land. So these are just a few. And there will be other terms that come up that I have not defined in this list, but we're going to walk through, I think this is 18 terms. We're going to walk through these 18 just to give you a sort of broad overview of some of the terms when it comes to sexuality. And I do encourage you to jump into the chat. I know there are folks who may have had these discussions before. I am not the end all be all expert, but I do know a good deal. But like I said, the world is very vast and changing. So please, as you feel led, please contribute to the conversation in the chat. So getting into some of the terms here. So we have allosexual. And allosexual just means anyone who experiences sexual attraction. So if you've ever experienced sexual attraction, you could identify as allosexual, right? And so it's the opposite, on the opposite end of the spectrum of what we would consider asexual. Asexual being someone who experiences a lack of attraction to others, right? And so this goes hand in hand with aromantic, which is someone who experiences little or no romantic attraction to others. And then we have androsexual, which is someone who's sexually attracted to men or masculinity. We have bicurious, This is someone who might be interested in or curious about having sex with someone whose sex or gender is different from their usual sex partners. Then we have bisexual. This is a term folks might be a little more familiar with. And this is someone who is emotionally or romantically or sexually attracted to more than one sex, gender, or gender identity. Oftentimes people think of bisexual as just being attracted to men and women, but the definition and the use of bisexual is much broader. So you could be attracted to men and non-binary folks. You could be attracted to women and other, identifying folks, transgender folks. So it is not limited, but it just means someone who is attracted to more than one type of gender identity. So we have the world of demi-romantic and demisexual. These are some of my favorite terms just because they have my name in them, but not because of how I identify. But demi-romantic is defined as little or no ability to feel romantically attracted to someone until forming a strong sexual or emotional connection with a person. And then you have demisexual, which is really the inverse of this, is someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction until they have a strong romantic connection with someone. Then we have another popular term, which is gay. This is someone who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to people of the same gender. It is often used for men who are attracted to men, but it is more broad than that. And so there are a lot of different gender identifying folks who would use that term to describe their sexual orientation. Then we have heteroflexible, and this is someone who identifies as heterosexual, but may experience situational attraction that falls outside of that definition or scope. Then we have heterosexual, and those are folks who identify as men who are attracted to people who identify as women, and vice versa. So women who are attracted to people who identify as men. And then we have lesbian, and that's someone who identifies as a woman or a non-binary person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to other women. And then this last batch of terms, we have LGBTQ, which is the infamous acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And we have pansexual. This is a person who has the potential or emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to people of any gender or sexual orientation. Then we have queer, which is a spectrum of sexual identities other than exclusively heterosexual. There are other ways that term queer is used as well, but for our intents and purposes, this is a good starter definition. Then we have questioning, which is people who consider themselves questioning or currently exploring their sexual orientation or sexuality. And we have same gender loving, and this is a term that some folks use instead of lesbian, gay, et cetera, to explain their attraction to someone whose gender identity is the same as theirs. And then scoliosexual, which is someone who's attracted to people who are non-binary. Are there any questions? I know I just threw a lot of terminology at you. Are there any questions about any of the terms? Are any of the terms new for folks? All right. So hearing none, I'm gonna move forward. Okay, so we are going to do an activity, and this is also a really good resource. If you find yourself in a situation where you're having to explain gender or sexuality or introduce some of these concepts to folks, this is a uncopyrighted resource. And I'm looking for the link because I want to share it in the document, in the chat. Give me a second here. Okay, so if I can find the chat. All right, so I'm putting a link to our genderbread person activity. Let me know if you're able to access the document. Give you a couple of minutes. Anyone having trouble accessing the document? Good. All right. So the genderbread person. The genderbread person helps us look at gender and sexuality through four main identifiers. So we have identity, attraction, sex, and expression. We're going to walk through each one. So this is what your worksheet looks like. It gives the definitions of everything that's on the genderbread person. So without further ado, let's get into it. So expression, gender expression. This is how you present your gender through your actions, your clothing, demeanor, name, etc. And how those presentations are viewed based on social expectations, right? So what this looks like is our name, our pronouns, the clothes we wear, our hairstyle, our makeup, our voice, right? Our bodies. These all have a way in our society of communicating certain things about our gender. And so I would like to invite you, you can think it to yourself or write it down on a sheet of paper, but to take a couple of minutes and think about what ways you are actively currently expressing your own gender. Take about one more minute. What ways are you actively currently expressing your gender? All right. Does anyone want to share? Going once, going twice. Anyone want to share? All right. Moving forward. So we have gender identity, and I know this is a little cut off here on the screen, but this is how you in your head experience and define your gender, based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand the options of gender to be. Okay, so take a moment and on that same sheet of paper or your phone or in your head, and write down how you define your gender. And so we have some symbols here. The first symbol is transgender. The second symbol is androgynous. And then we have the female and male symbols as well. But these are, again, not exhaustive of how you can identify in terms of your gender. But take a moment, reflect on it, write it down. All right. Gonna move forward. So then on our genderbread person, we have attraction. And this is how you find yourself feeling drawn or not drawn to other people in sexual, romantic, and or other ways categorized within gender, often categorized within gender. So our gender attraction can look a lot of different ways. We can be drawn to a combination of folks. We can be drawn to particular folks based on how they identify. We can be drawn to folks sexually. We can be drawn to folks romantically, right? So take a moment again and reflect or write down, who do you feel drawn to sexually, romantically, or in other ways? All right. And then, of course, we have sex. And sex can include the physical traits that you were born with or developed that we would think of as sex characteristics, as well as the sex you were assigned at birth. And so, you know, we can think of this in chromosomes, we can think of this in what's on your birth certificate. We can also think of this in regard to genitalia. But take a moment and think about, you know, what your anatomical sex is, has been, what sex you were assigned at birth. All right. So on your worksheet with the link I provided, and let me know if I need to share it again, you should see these categories and spectrums of none to infinity for gender identity, gender expression, anatomical sex, and then at the bottom, sexual orientation and romantic orientation. So just take a moment to mark off, for each one where you might identify. So for instance, for myself, with gender identity, I would identify pretty high up on womanness, middle of the road on manness. In regard to gender expression, I would identify a little lower in regards to femininity, and a little higher for myself with masculinity. In terms of anatomical sex for myself, I would be pretty high on femaleness, right? And then for me, my sexual attraction is high for both men and women. And then my romantic attraction is very high for women and very low for men. And then I was assigned female at birth. So that is how I would fill this out. But again, take a moment for yourself and fill it out for yourself, challenge yourself to really think about some of these things. Some of us don't think about this often. Some of us think about this very often. But wherever you are, just challenge yourself to take a moment to reflect and fill this out. And so I'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes. Gonna take about 1 more minute, and if anyone needs more time, just let me know. Okay. Let's regroup. I would love to hear from one or two people of how this activity has been for them working through this gingerbread worksheet.
I'll go.
Okay.
I really enjoyed it, and it was really nice to kind of reflect on how my gender expression changes day to day, and think about like how some days I really lean into like the femininity style and grooming and choices like that, and then other days I don't necessarily identify it as masculine, but it's not as feminine, so maybe it is masculine, or maybe it's another category. And yeah, but I really enjoyed reflecting on all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. One more person want to share? All right. We are going to move forward. Oh, Yavo, did you want to share?
No, it's okay.
Okay. All right. All right. I want to say a little bit more about sexual orientation and romantic orientation. I know we didn't really walk through those categories as much, but they do exist on spectrums, and they can be separate from one another. So your sexual orientation can be very different from your romantic orientation. And so sexual orientation is really who you're sexually attracted to, and it exists on a spectrum from allosexual, meaning you experience sexual attraction, and asexual, meaning you lack that experience of sexual attraction for other people. And then we have the myriad of ways in which sexual orientation might show up, right? And so some of these terms we went over earlier. And then the same exists with romantic attraction, but romantic attraction is not necessarily tied to sex or to sexual feelings. And so again, allo-romantic meaning you experience romantic attraction, and then aromantic meaning you lack or have very little of those romantic experiences toward others. And again, here we see the same thing in all the different myriad of ways that romantic attraction can show up, right? And so again, just encouraging you, to continue to explore some of these terms and things, and none of it is exhaustive. It's ever changing. Again, new terms are always being added because we are limited sometimes in our language and what that can describe for us. So any questions before we move on? All right. You all are rock stars. So hearing none, I'm going to move on to stigma. And so stigma, by definition, is a mark of shame or discredit. In our work in HIV, we hear stigma come up quite a lot, and we work to combat stigma because no one should have to feel shame or discredit, right? And so we want to think about stigma. We have to think about the way stigma shows up. Stigma can show up for us personally in our personal lives. There are stigmas that we may sometimes place upon ourselves. But this can also be informed by whatever environments we're in, be it our home, our workplace, our churches, our faith spaces, right? So there's environmental stigma as well. And then our environmental stigma is often informed by structural stigma, which is really the larger systems. And so stigma is embedded in all three of these avenues of life that we traverse. And so it's important that we think about the ways that it's showing up. And so we are going to, we're going to do a little breakout activity, and we're going to put you all in groups. And each group, each group is going to be assigned one of these populations that is considered to be one of the populations vulnerable. Well, there's people living with HIV, and then the other three are populations that are vulnerable to HIV. And so we want to have a discussion about stigma. And so we're going to break you all into breakout groups, and each group will discuss one of these populations and discuss the types of the examples of the types of ways stigma might show up personally, environmentally, and or structurally. And so, Marcus, are we ready for the breakout groups? Okay.
All set. Yep.
Awesome. You should be invited to a breakout group momentarily.
Demi, how long do you want the breakout rooms to go?
Can you give them about 8 minutes?
8 minutes? All right.
Thanks.
Yep.
Hey, everyone, welcome back. Hope that was a good discussion. If we could have one person from each group sort of share out some of the things y'all talked about, some of the examples you came up with, and we can start with people living with HIV.
We just talked about how from a personal, or my group was Nubia and Claire, we talked about from a personal level, how they might be internalized stigma. So like prior to their status or when they recently find out their status. And this is me speaking from someone as a woman living with HIV myself and what I went through when I first found out my diagnosis, just trying to figure out like, oh my gosh, nobody's gonna want me, you know, I'm not worthy of having a relationship and all those different things that go through your head, or, you know, or I'm a, you know, a whore, or sorry if I'm cursing, but, you know, those type of sentiments of being promiscuous and what that means for you, which can be very internal. You can internalize it on a daily basis of like, it could affect your self-esteem, right? It could affect how you show up in the world. And then from an environmental perspective, we talked about how most people still see HIV and the stigma of HIV is still very much, oh, that's for gay people or gay guys, more specifically, right? And so from an environmental level, like it kind of keeps people in that personal stigma loop of like, well, I'm afraid to come out because people may judge me from that outside environment of, you know, now we're moving into the space where like, there must be something wrong with you or you're dirty if you have HIV, right? Or other STIs. And then from a structural level, we didn't get into it, but if we're thinking about the state of Georgia, how there's still, you know, HIV disclosure laws on the books. And so from that point of view, I'm from Texas, so it's not structural on the books anymore since like 94, but there are still people that have been prosecuted for attempted, assault with a deadly weapon and things like that for spitting on people or things like that, or with like an enhancement added onto their charges. But yeah, that's what we talked about. That whole stigma just keeps people in that personal cycle of self-deprecation when you have those environmental and structural stigmas that are still floating around.
Absolutely. Y'all really, nailed it with your discussion for sure. So thank you for sharing. Next group, people identifying as LGBTQ.
We had a little bit of tech issues in the beginning, but we got there in the end.
Okay.
So we talked about interpersonal stigma, or personal stigma, not knowing how to identify yourself, or maybe internalizing stigma, so you don't really want to label yourself or know how to label yourself. Environmental stigma, if you are kind of in a church or a neighborhood or a family that perpetuates stigma, you'll eventually kind of be living in it and it's hard to break free. And then structural laws, and like with the Supreme Court possibly wanting to overturn marriage equality, things like that hanging in the balance.
For sure. Definitely. Good work. Thank you for sharing. People who inject drugs. We have someone from this group share what you talked about.
Yeah, so we talked about, the idea of people who inject drugs and its close relation to the assumption that they have HIV or contract HIV, like from like the pop culture in the 80s and the early 90s, like all the different movies, and even in the, growing up in the inner city, it was always kind of very, very closely related, right? Like if you was doing that, then you were probably a person living with HIV or would contract it. We talked about like an appearance, I think we gave a few examples of our work around like, how people appear, and people make the assumption like people who use drugs, they're going to steal, or all of those kind of things. Even in 2022, I gave an example of my job around like a client coming in and the assumption that they were a drug user, and the question of safety, always shows up. Those biases that, that's really attached to people who inject drugs and stuff like that. I think, I think that's mainly what we talked about.
Okay, absolutely. Definitely. Thank you for sharing. And then our last group, people who are incarcerated.
We talked about personal issues like developing new relationships possibly, and how you're rejected by the society, oftentimes your family also. And then we talked about systemic issues like getting a job, housing, and also voting. Like if people say, did you vote? And now you have to say why you didn't vote. Like there's stigma with that. And we talked about trustworthiness is diminished in the eyes of everyone, regardless of what the crime is. And lack of ability to be redeemed.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Each group did great, I think. Part of this activity, what's apparent is that stigma exists for all of these groups in very layered, complex ways for each group, right? And so with this knowledge, right, of stigma, we're going to move into our discussion on theology, with the understanding that theology and our faith communities impact every layer of stigma, right? Have the potential to impact every layer of stigma for better or for worse, whether that be personal, environmental, or even structural, right? So we're going to move into our discussion on theology. Thank you again for your participation in the breakout rooms with that activity. So thinking about theology. So theology can be defined as the study of the nature of God and religious belief. I like to think of theology in terms of the questions that it asks. Theology asks, who is God? What is God like? What is God doing? What can God do? How is God in relationship with us? And how are we in relationship with God? There are other questions, but these are sort of the main ones that theology is asking. And so with that, because there's infinite ways we could answer these questions, there are infinite theological possibilities. And so the Christian church in particular has come at theology in different ways. And so these are some of the types of theology we can think about. You can think about natural theology, which is a knowledge about God that primarily comes through nature. Then there's biblical theology, which is knowledge about God that primarily comes through the Bible. And then we have historical theology, which is knowledge about God through history, sort of thinking about canons, what gets canonized into doctrine, and what councils have set together. And then moving into this other column, we have systematic theology. And so this is knowledge about God through the three categories I just listed, through nature, through the Bible, through history. And so really thinking about those combined as systems that inform how we might know God. And then you have dogmatic theology, which is placing the emphasis on what is taught. And so, what is taught, what did these councils decide was theologically appropriate, and what is being passed down. And then you have practical theology, which is an emphasis on practicing the knowledge and the ideas about God, and sort of bridging the gap between what do we know about God, but how does this impact us in everyday life, right? So those are some of the types of theology, just to give you a broad overview. And then I wanted to offer some useful theologies for social change that I really like. So again, and these are all more practical theologies, again, thinking about the types, but if we want to think about social change and we want to think about combating stigma, these are some theologies that might be able to get you there. So there's liberation theology, there's womanist theology, and there's queer theology. I am not going to take the time to walk through all of these, because within each one of these theologies, there are a bunch of theologians who agree and disagree on different things. But these are some of the broader social change theologies that I think are worth taking a look at. If you're interested, you can do a Google search and get some of those top theologians and books on these theologies. So what I want to talk to us about today is dangerous theology as it relates to a lot of the discussions we've already had in regards to sexuality and stigma. And I want to make a claim, and my claim is that, and this is my claim, I'm owning this as my claim, that dangerous theology is any theology that makes a claim about sexuality. And I say that as to say that when we are talking about sexuality and we're talking about how God fits into our understandings of sexuality, it can be dangerous because sexuality is so diverse. And what I mean by dangerous is that we can harm one another in our theology if we're not careful. So the thing about dangerous theology is that it doesn't mean it's not useful, right? We all use fire on a daily basis. We might use knives for cooking or whatever it is, right? And so these are useful tools. These are useful things. And if we're not careful, we could hurt ourselves and we could hurt others. So given that my claim that any theology that makes a claim about sexuality is a dangerous one, that pretty much includes almost every theology, right? And so when we're thinking about our own theology and how we answer these questions about God and how we're in relationship with God and how God's in relationship with us, we need to proceed with caution. And we need to understand our own flame, right? And we need to sharpen safely. And so that really requires us to have an awareness of our theology, an awareness of other theologies, and just an overall understanding of people, right? And so you want to be able to protect yourself, you want to be able to protect others, and that protection for yourself and others comes with really understanding, well, what is it you believe? Why do you believe it? Does your belief harm others? And is it important for others to believe what you believe? Why or why not? And I think if you can, take your belief system and answer these questions, you're in a good posture in terms of how you share your theology with others when you choose to and when you don't choose to, how you have conversations about your theology with others whose theology may be different from yours, right? And I think it also allows us to refrain from projecting or assuming that everyone does have the same theology, because a lot of times we do not have the same theologies, right? And so I want to open it up for discussion. And I just want to ask, in terms of dangerous theology, in your experience, in your context, right? Have you seen dangerous theology at work? And if so, how so? And do you, in what ways could understanding our beliefs have protected someone from those dangerous theologies?
I'll share.
Yeah.
I realized that I was contributing to dangerous theology without realizing I was contributing to dangerous theology, because I thought I was just sharing what I was taught. Sorry, let me turn on my camera. Thought I was just sharing what I was taught, which is I thought was right. And I thought that everybody believed that if you're a Christian, until I realized, oh, wow, Christians believe differently. And it doesn't mean that someone is right or wrong. It just means that there's space for different thought. And so what helped me was actually doing exactly what you have listed here. Is I don't think I ever considered what I believed. I know it didn't feel good, the stuff that I would hear, but I thought it was just right. And because, the Bible said it and God said it, then, even though it didn't feel right, it doesn't mean that it wasn't right. And so me just going through the process of asking myself, what do I believe and why do I believe it? And realizing that a lot of my beliefs, especially because I hadn't even processed it myself, was harming people, because I hadn't even done the work. And so I felt like I was dangerous on a whole nother level. So I couldn't even tell you why I believe what I believe. I just thought it was the right belief. And so I realized just how important it was to be able to think through my own process, and to think through what that meant to love my brother and sister, even if I disagreed, and then continue to challenge myself on my own blinders, and just continue to grow in it. So I think that going through that whole process was very, very helpful for me, and for myself to build relationships with people who thought differently than I did, so that I can see, so I can see the difference and begin to appreciate the difference, and then see myself grow, and learn in that process. So it was good. I mean, it was a very hard and very uncomfortable process, but it was one of the best processes for me, because I was like, yeah, I don't even know what I believe anymore, but it was good. It was very, very good. So just wanted to say, yes, this is very important process.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing it. I think that's so important. I do think a lot of folks don't provide themselves the space, like you were saying, to really dig deep on their own beliefs. Where do these come from? Why do I believe it? And what impact does that have in the world? And to just pause and just ask yourself those questions, and sit in, whatever discomfort may or may not be there for you. So I think that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
Well, I'll share. Hey, Demi.
Hey.
I would share. I would say I put in the, when you first started talking about sharpen carefully, I realized at one point in time I was running with a knife, but not aimed at myself. It was aimed at everybody else, because as I started waking up and realizing some of the things that I was taught about the Bible and the perspective and some of the stories, I was not feeling comfortable on the inside, but I was going along with it because, just growing up, you're groomed that you don't speak against or you don't question what the faith leader has to say. And so, but I was not happy and comfortable on the inside. And so once I reached an age to start learning and establishing a relationship with God for myself, I started realizing that I had a purpose, but instead of being argumentative and confronting, I had to find subtle ways to just start being more at peace with myself. And I'm enjoying the journey. And at the same time, it's teaching me some spaces aren't for me. I used to feel like I had to be in certain spaces and I was obligated, but I wasn't comfortable or happy, or even would become argumentative or questioning some people. But at the same time, it was like, well, some of these spaces just aren't for me. And it's okay for them to not be for me. And as I've learned recently is sometimes I can say there have been many times in my life I have gone around the church to get to God, so that I can really have a better relationship and I don't have to force my say on anybody. And I'm on that journey because of you all, Demi, I'm on that journey about how for me, women have been oppressed, even using stories in women from the Bible, and how women have been oppressed even by men of color. So I'm going through that journey now and trying not to turn the table over or set the building on fire. So, but I'm enjoying myself in this process.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And yes, like that idea of being able to protect others, right? And then also protecting yourself, you know, that awareness of your belief, it works both ways. So absolutely. Anyone else want to share? All right. Well, with that,
Demi,
yes, yes, yes.
What I will say is that I think that this idea of interrogating or spaces of faith teaching us to interrogate our beliefs is very liberating, because most of us didn't grow up in spaces. It's a sin to question God, but not really. It's really what your pastor taught you, like Ms. Stringfellow said. And so what we're doing with that is not letting God be God and argue with God, because there's no relationship. I always tell people, you can get mad at God and they look at me, I'm like, God can handle it. Like, every relationship has conflict and friction and tension. You cannot like everything God does. So that's the first place, is to be yourself before God. But even more than that, like, I studied liberation theology and womanist theology in seminary, but because it doesn't impact me, I was never super curious about queer theology, or even thought of it as a companion alongside womanist and liberation theology, which is what white people do that don't know anything about liberation theology. Sorry, white sisters and brothers on the call, liberation theology or womanist theology. So a lot of times, just respecting the fact that there's no need to have an opinion on stuff you don't know about, and you can get curious about it and go look into it, right? Instead of saying this white male heteronormative imperialistic colonizing way of looking at the Bible is the only interpretation, and it oppresses us as we're doing it, but we don't even have the capacity to get that. So
Yeah, absolutely. And it's to your point, if we don't do that work of opening it up and liberating ourselves to be able to ask these questions, we will only continue to perpetuate the harm through these theologies. Because it's not that they're not useful in certain contexts, but they are still dangerous. And so if we're not interrogating it, we will still perpetuate the same cycles that we've been seeing, and the places where theology shows up and does oppress other folks, whether that be us or someone else who identifies differently from us. So yeah, it's very important. Thank you for sharing. All right, anyone else before we wrap up? All right. Well, we are going to close out. I do want to leave it open in the if anyone has any questions. But otherwise, we're gonna be getting out of here early. So are there any questions?
Demi, I think you did a fantastic job.
You.
Thank you. I enjoyed
Yes.
learning from you.
Yes.
Awesome, awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I
Demi.
enjoyed the gingerbread man, the gingerbread
Yes,
person.
yes.
I haven't seen the gingerbread person. I'm
Right.
hungry over here, but I have not I have not seen the gingerbread person in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, me as well. And I think it's cool that it's not copyrighted and folks can use it, you know, as a tool. It's pretty awesome.
Cool.
Awesome. Anyone else? Any questions, comments, concerns? All right. Well, I'm gonna give you 40 or so minutes of your time back. I hope you all have a great week, and if I don't see you, enjoy whatever holidays you may or may not celebrate, and take care of yourselves. Thank you so much. All right.
Have a good one.
You too. Thank you.